Well, I'll see when I find the full statement. I'll try to.
Come on, let's move it.
Of that country, of South Vietnam, and something is still left for our hopes for domestic progress here within the United States.
You think the NLF should participate from the start in the Paris talks?
Excuse me.
Do you think the NLF should participate from the start in the Paris
Well,
talks?
I think that if other countries are brought in, if the discussions are going to include just the United States and North Vietnam, these preliminary discussions, I think that's worthwhile. But I think we have to face the fact that the National Liberation Front is going to have to be brought in at some time. What I would like to see is that the South Vietnam government be willing to start negotiations with the National Liberation Front while we're conducting the negotiations with the North Vietnamese.
Senator, they've said that they don't want to do that. They're quite firm on that. How do you persuade them? Do you threaten to leave or what?
Well, I think I've already made that clear. They're going to have to carry on the major burden of the struggle. And I think our foreign policy in that part of the world, which has an effect on what we do here in the United States, as well as what our relationships with the rest of the world, is not going to be determined by General Key and General Chu.
Do you think that the bombing should be halted altogether as the
I think
peace talks
those
begin?
discussions, that's the purpose of these preliminary discussions that are going to begin.
Senator, don't you think that the Johnson administration is going to bring the National Liberation Front in eventually anyway? Don't you believe that?
Well, they have not made that clear yet. We haven't heard any statement from them to that effect. I would hope that's what's going to be done.
Senator, what do you do to force Saigon to be willing to negotiate with the NLF?
Well, I've outlined at various times what I think has to be done, various kinds of steps that need to be taken if we can't achieve our objectives there. I think that we should, as I've said, we should be willing to protect the major population centers, and the burden of the conflict will have to be taken over by the South Vietnamese, which means along the demilitarized zone as well as all of the search and destroy missions.
Do you think the start of the peace talks is going to reduce the impact of your own campaign for peace?
And I think that's so unimportant in comparison to trying to achieve a peaceful solution to that struggle.
What kind of international support do you have in mind?
Well, I've suggested a strengthened ICC or a group that would be agreed upon by the various governments who have a direct interest in that part of the world, or as a third alternative, something that could be recommended and accepted by Utah and the United Nations.
Thank you, Senator.
Please turn around here.
Good morning.
I'd like to return to. Now, it's difficult while the war in Vietnam is going on because we have such an unbalanced budget. But I think that's what we have to, another reason, not only the fact that we are saving America, not only for the fact that we're going to save the devastation of South Vietnam do we want peace, but also the fact of what it's doing here within our own country. I think the $85 million that we spend a day in South Vietnam can be used here in the United States. It can be used here in... go to the negotiating table in Paris on May 10th. I think that's an important step forward. But even while we do that, I think we have to remember, even while we do that, the killing is going to go on. And the war is going to go on. And that struggle in Vietnam is going to go on. And I think while it goes on, that we have a right to demand of the government of South Vietnam that they broaden their political base, that they bring in other political elements within South Vietnam, so that they will have the strongest possible group to negotiate as they ultimately must with the National Liberation Front. I think we have the right to demand of them that they end their corruption and their dishonesty. That I don't think it's acceptable here in the United States. It's not acceptable for our government to accept that the Commissioner of Customs in South Vietnam is one of the greatest smugglers of gold and opium into South Vietnam, according to a congressional committee. I don't think it's acceptable here in the United States that we draft our young men and send them to Vietnam, and they will still be drafted and they'll still be sent to South Vietnam despite the discussions and despite the negotiations, and yet a young man in South Vietnam can buy his way out of the draft. I don't think that's acceptable to the people of the state of Indiana. I don't think it's acceptable to the people in the United States, and it wouldn't be acceptable to me if I'm elected President of the United States. I think that can be used here in Jefferson.
Don't let him stop short. We're going to get hurt. I know that. He knows it. Watch yourself, you know? Go shop.
That man is Robert Kennedy. Your man is sweet like diamond. From California to New York Island. We drive with forest and country water.
Where are we going to do this? Start rolling already.
I am pleased that a site has been agreed upon to commence the negotiations to bring an end to the fighting in the war in Vietnam. The selection of an appropriate location for the discussion has taken such a long period of time, and that I think that it indicates the difficulty that we still face in reaching an agreement with the North Vietnamese and with the Viet Cong and the National Liberation Front. And I'm afraid that the fighting is going to continue in South Vietnam even while the negotiations go on. But I fervently hope that both sides will seek to stop the killing as early as possible, and that an international force might be brought into South Vietnam to supervise a ceasefire. There is an even more urgency than ever before to broaden the base of the effectiveness of the government in South Vietnam, to include the possibility of negotiating with the National Liberation Front directly, and to bring the National Liberation Front into the negotiations in an active way so that we can achieve a ceasefire in that part of the world.